Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a channel where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres help you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see our little community stretching across the world. Now it's time to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath and let the day melt away. Allow my voice to carry you softly into sleep, to a place where imagination flows and dreams begin. The coach arrived as dusk settled over the moorland, its lanterns swaying with each turn of the narrow road. Inside, passengers sat wrapped in travelling cloaks and thick scarves, watching through frosted windows as the landscape transformed from rolling hills to dense woodland. Snow had been falling since mid-afternoon, laying itself across the earth in a silence so complete it seemed to absorb all other sound. The driver, a man named Hobbs who had travelled this route for 20 winters, pulled his coat tighter and squinted into the gathering darkness. He knew every curve, every dip in the road, yet winter always managed to make familiar paths feel strange and new. The horses moved steadily, their breath rising in thick clouds, their hooves finding purchase on the snow-covered ground with the careful instinct of animals accustomed to uncertain footing. Inside the coach, conversation had dwindled to occasional murmurs. A woman in a grey travelling dress adjusted her shawl and remarked to no one in particular that the snow seemed heavier than the almanac had predicted. Her companion, an elderly gentleman with spectacles that caught the dim lantern light, agreed with a thoughtful nod. He mentioned that winter in these parts often arrived with its own intentions, paying little mind to human forecasts. A younger man seated across from them gazed out at the snow-laden trees passing slowly by. He carried the look of someone travelling a great distance, though whether toward home or away from it remained unclear. His hands rested on a leather satchel, and every so often he would glance down at it as though reassuring himself of its continued presence. The coach passed through a small village, its cottages dark except for the warm glow of firelight behind shuttered windows. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, lazy columns before being caught by the wind and scattered across the darkening sky. A dog barked once as they passed, then fell silent, as though even animals understood the need for quiet on such a night. Hobbs guided the horses around a final bend, and there, nestled at the edge of the forest where the road widened into a clearing, stood the Thornfield Arms. Light spilled from every window, golden and inviting, cutting through the blue-grey twilight. The inn rose 2 stories high, its stone walls thick and sturdy, its roof heavy with fresh snow. Smoke poured from 3 chimneys, carrying with it the promise of warmth and shelter. The coach rolled to a gentle stop in the courtyard. Hobbs climbed down stiffly, his joints protesting the cold, and opened the door for his passengers. They emerged slowly, stretching cramped limbs and breathing in the sharp, clean air. The woman in grey paused to look up at the inn's facade, noting the care with which lanterns had been hung along the entrance path, each one sheltered from the wind, yet bright enough to guide weary travellers. The elderly gentleman descended carefully, accepting Hobbs's steadying hand. He remarked that he had stayed at the Thornfield Arms once before, many years ago, and remembered it as a place of singular comfort. The young man with the satchel was last to exit, his eyes taking in the scene with a mixture of relief and something deeper, perhaps gratitude for having reached shelter before true night claimed the moorland. Hobbs began unloading luggage, placing each trunk and case carefully on the snow-cleared stones. He worked with the methodical efficiency of someone who had performed this task countless times, yet never carelessly. As he worked, the inn's front door opened, releasing a wave of warmth and the rich scent of cooking food. The innkeeper emerged, a woman of middle years with kind eyes and capable hands. She wore a simple dark dress covered by a clean white apron, and her hair was pulled back in a neat arrangement. Her name was Mrs. Hartwell, and she had run the Thornfield Arms for 15 years, inheriting it from her late husband, who had loved the place as much as she now did. "Welcome, welcome," she called, her voice carrying easily across the courtyard despite the wind. "Come inside before the cold claims you entirely." The passengers needed no further encouragement. They gathered their belongings and made their way toward the entrance, their footsteps crunching in the fresh snow. The young man lingered for a moment, turning to look back at the dark moorland they had crossed. Something in his expression suggested he was marking this arrival, fixing it in memory as a significant threshold crossed. Mrs. Hartwell held the door wide, ushering them into the warmth. As each person passed, she offered a welcoming nod, the kind that conveyed both hospitality and the quiet understanding that travelers often carried more than luggage when they arrived at an inn on a winter's night. The door closed behind them, shutting out the cold and the darkness. Inside, the Thornfield Arms embraced them with light, warmth, and the promise of rest. The entrance hall of the Thornfield Arms possessed the kind of warmth that seemed to have accumulated over decades. It was not merely the heat from the nearby fireplace, though that certainly contributed. Rather, it was something woven into the very walls, a sense of countless arrivals, countless welcomes, countless moments when cold-numbed travelers had crossed the threshold and felt the gentle shock of shelter. The floor was laid with dark slate tiles, worn smooth by years of footsteps. A long wooden bench stood against one wall, its surface polished by the weight of waiting luggage and resting limbs. Above it hung a series of brass hooks, some already occupied by coats and hats left by earlier guests. The walls themselves were panelled in rich oak, darkened by age but well maintained, their surfaces reflecting the firelight in soft, amber tones. Mrs. Hartwell moved with practiced efficiency, helping the newly arrived guests remove their snow-dampened outer garments. She took each coat and cloak with care, shaking off the excess snow before hanging them near the fire to dry. The woman in grey unwound her scarf slowly, revealing a face lined with the comfortable fatigue of long travel. She accepted Mrs. Hartwell's assistance with a grateful murmur. "You'll want to warm yourselves," Mrs. Hartwell said, gesturing toward the archway that led to the main parlour. "There's mulled cider just drawn, and the fire's been built up for the evening." The elderly gentleman removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a handkerchief before replacing them carefully. Most thoughtful, Mrs. Hartwell. The journey was longer than anticipated, though Hobbs managed it admirably. Outside, Hobbs could be heard directing the stable hand, ensuring the horses were properly settled for the night. The sound of hooves on cobblestones, muffled by snow, drifted through the thick walls. It was a comforting sound, the completion of the day's work, the securing of animals and equipment before the night deepened further. The young man with the satchel set his burden down carefully beside the bench. He stretched his shoulders, working out the stiffness of hours spent in cramped quarters. When he removed his hat, dark hair fell across his forehead, and his eyes carried the particular brightness of someone who has been traveling toward something specific, something important. "Your first visit to the Thornfield Arms?" Mrs. Hartwell asked him kindly. "It is," he replied, his voice quiet but clear. "I've heard it spoken of, though, recommended by a friend who passed this way last winter." "Then you're most welcome. I hope we'll live up to your expectations." She indicated a doorway to the left. "The register is in the parlor, if you'd be so good as to sign in once you've had a chance to warm up." From deeper within the inn came the sound of voices, the low murmur of other guests already settled for the evening. Somewhere, a clock chimed the hour, its tone mellow and unhurried. The entrance hall seemed to gather these sounds and hold them gently, adding them to its long memory of winter evenings. A young maid appeared from a side corridor, her arms full of fresh linens. She bobbed a quick curtsy to the new arrivals and hurried up the staircase that rose along the far wall. The stairs were wide and solid, their banisters smooth under countless hands. At the landing halfway up, a tall window looked out onto the courtyard, though now it showed only darkness and the reflection of lamplight on glass. Mrs. Hartwell moved toward the archway, clearly expecting the guests to follow. "We've prepared rooms on the second floor. The east wing catches the morning sun nicely, though I expect you'll all sleep well past dawn after such a journey." The woman in grey followed first, her steps slow but steady. The elderly gentleman came next, pausing to examine a painting that hung near the archway. It depicted the inn itself in summer, surrounded by green moorland and a sky full of soft clouds. He studied it with the attention of someone who appreciated such details, then nodded to himself as if confirming something before moving on. The young man brought up the rear, but not before glancing back at the entrance door. Through its small window, the night pressed close, dark and complete. Inside, however, everything spoke of safety and established comfort. The contrast seemed to satisfy him, and he turned away, following the others into the warmth. The entrance hall settled into quiet once more, holding its post as the boundary between the winter world outside and the refuge within. Coats dripped slowly near the fire. The bench waited patiently for the next arrival, and the inn breathed on, steady and sure through the deepening night. The parlor at the Thornfield Arms occupied the heart of the inn, both literally and spiritually. It was a generous room, neither so large as to feel empty, nor so small as to feel cramped. The ceiling rose high enough to accommodate the warmth from the great fireplace without trapping it oppressively, and tall windows along one wall looked out onto what would be, in daylight, a view of the moorland rolling away to distant hills. Tonight, however, those windows reflected only the room itself, the fire blazing in its stone hearth, the lamps burning steadily in their sconces, and the figures of guests gathered in various states of repose. Heavy curtains drawn against the cold framed each window in deep burgundy fabric that seemed to absorb and hold the warmth of the lamplight. The fireplace dominated the room. Built of local stone, it rose from floor to ceiling, its mantel carved with simple but elegant designs depicting leaves and acorns. The fire itself burned with the authority of carefully selected logs, oak primarily, chosen for its steady heat and long burn. Flames danced and shifted, creating ever-changing patterns of light and shadow across the hearthstones. Before the fire, arranged in a comfortable semicircle, stood a collection of chairs and settees. Each piece bore the marks of long use but careful maintenance. The upholstery, while faded in places, remained intact and clean. Cushions had been placed thoughtfully, offering comfort to backs and arms weary from travel. Small tables stood within easy reach, their surfaces ready to hold cups, books, or whatever a guest might need close at hand. Several people already occupied these seats when the new arrivals entered. A middle-aged couple sat together on a settee, their heads bent over a book they appeared to be reading together, though more likely they were simply sharing the comfortable silence of long companionship. A woman of perhaps 30 sat alone near the window, working on a piece of embroidery that caught the lamplight with each movement of her needle. A young boy, no more than 8 or 9, played quietly on the floor near the hearth, arranging wooden blocks into careful formations. He worked with the intense concentration children bring to their chosen tasks, occasionally glancing up at the fire as though drawing inspiration from its dancing flames. Mrs. Hartwell led the new guests into the room with a welcoming gesture. "Make yourselves comfortable. I'll bring the cider directly." The woman in grey settled into a chair near the fire with an audible sigh of relief. She extended her hands toward the warmth, palms open, as though offering them to the flames for healing. The elderly gentleman chose a seat with a view of the entire room, a position that suggested he enjoyed observing his surroundings. He arranged himself carefully, adjusting cushions until he achieved the precise configuration of comfort he sought. The young man with the satchel took a chair somewhat apart from the others, though still within the fire's sphere of influence. He set his satchel on the floor beside him, keeping it close, and gazed into the flames with an expression that suggested his thoughts were traveling distances far greater than those he had covered by coach. A large clock stood against one wall, its pendulum swinging with patient regularity. The sound it made was gentle, a soft tick-tock that added to rather than disturb the room's peaceful atmosphere. Near it, a bookshelf held a collection of volumes available to guests, their spines showing the wear of frequent borrowing. Mrs. Hartwell returned carrying a tray laden with mugs. Steam rose from each one, carrying the scent of apples, cinnamon, and cloves. She distributed them with quiet efficiency, ensuring each guest received their portion of warmth and welcome. The woman in grey accepted hers with both hands, bringing it close to her face to breathe in the fragrant steam. "This is most welcome," the elderly gentleman remarked after his first sip. "The recipe is excellent." "My grandmother's," Mrs. Hartwell replied with a modest smile, "though I've adjusted the spices to suit the modern palate." The woman working on embroidery looked up and offered a friendly nod to the new arrivals. Her face was kind, her eyes reflecting the firelight with a gentle warmth. She made a comment about the weather, observing that the snow seemed intent on continuing through the night. Others murmured agreement, adding their own observations about the wind's direction and the likely accumulation by morning. These small exchanges wove themselves into the room's atmosphere, creating the particular form of companionship that exists among strangers who find themselves sharing shelter during inclement weather. There was no pressure to converse extensively, yet neither was there the cold silence of complete isolation. It was a middle space, comfortable and easily inhabited. The fire crackled and popped, sending up occasional spar. As the evening progressed, the parlour at the Thornfield Arms took on the quality of a painting slowly coming into focus. Each person settled more deeply into their chosen space, their postures softening, their movements becoming less purposeful and more languid. The warmth worked its subtle magic, unknotting tension from shoulders and loosening the grip of cold that had penetrated during travel. The woman in grey, whose name proved to be Mrs. Ashford, engaged in quiet conversation with a couple reading together. They spoke of roads and weather, of the reliability of coach services, and of the small villages they had passed through on their respective journeys. Their voices never rose above a comfortable murmur, adding texture to the room without demanding attention from those who preferred silence. The elderly gentleman, who introduced himself as Professor Wickham when Mrs. Hartwell brought around the register for signing, had produced a small leather-bound notebook from his pocket. He wrote in it occasionally, pausing between entries to gaze into the fire or around the room, as though recording not just facts, but impressions, the weight and feel of the evening. The young man with the satchel remained somewhat apart, though not disagreeably so. He had accepted his mug of cider and held it carefully, sipping occasionally while his attention drifted between the fire and the window. Once, when a particularly strong gust of wind rattled the glass, he turned to look, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he returned his gaze to the flames, seeming to find something there that answered whatever question had crossed his mind. The woman with the embroidery set her work aside and stood, stretching with the unself-conscious ease of someone comfortable in her surroundings. She moved to the bookshelf and ran her fingers along the spines, tilting her head to read titles. After some consideration, she selected a volume and returned to her seat, settling in with the book open on her lap. The boy with the wooden blocks completed his construction, an elaborate formation that might have been a castle, or perhaps a ship, depending on one's perspective. He sat back on his heels, surveying his work with satisfaction. His mother, the woman from the couple on the settee, reached down to ruffle his hair affectionately. He leaned into the touch briefly before returning his attention to his creation. A maid entered, carrying a tray of small cakes and biscuits, setting it on a table near the center of the room where all could reach it easily. The offerings were simple but appealing, the kind of sustenance that suited the hour between travel and supper. Mrs. Ashford took a biscuit and nibbled it slowly, her eyes half closed in contentment. Professor Wickham struck up a conversation with the young man, asking in a gentle, non-intrusive way about his journey. The young man, whose name was revealed to be Thomas Brennan, responded with polite brevity at first, but gradually warmed to the professor's genuine interest. He mentioned that he was traveling to visit family, relatives he had not seen in some years. There was something in the way he said it that suggested the visit carried significant weight, though he did not elaborate. Family reunions can be complex affairs, Professor Wickham observed, his tone neutral and understanding. Though worth the difficulty of winter travel, I expect. Thomas nodded, gripping his mug a bit tighter. Yes, worth it, I believe. The conversation drifted to other topics, the professor sharing observations about the moorland they had crossed, speaking of its history and the old stones that dotted certain hills. He possessed the gift of interesting discourse without pedantry, offering knowledge as one might offer a cup of tea, something to be enjoyed rather than endured. As the evening deepened, more guests arrived, shown in by Mrs. Hartwell or her staff. Each new arrival went through the same gentle process: the removal of outer garments, the offer of warm cider, the settling into available seats. The parlor expanded to accommodate them without feeling crowded, as though the room itself understood how to make space for all who needed it. A merchant and his wife, arriving late from a delayed coach, were particularly grateful for the warmth. They spoke of nearly losing their way when snow obscured familiar landmarks, and of their relief at seeing the inn's lights through the darkness. Their story was met with sympathetic murmurs from other guests, all of whom understood how quickly winter travel could turn uncertain. The fire was built up periodically by a quiet servant who appeared and disappeared without fuss, adding logs with the practiced judgment of someone who knew exactly how much fuel would sustain the perfect level of warmth. The flames climbed and settled, maintaining their steady performance. Mrs. Hartwell circulated through the room, attending to small needs before guests. When Mrs. Hartwell announced that supper was served, the guests rose from their seats with varying degrees of reluctance, having grown comfortable in their fireside positions. However, the scent wafting from the dining room proved persuasive, a rich combination of roasted meat, baked bread, and herbs that spoke directly to appetites sharpened by travel and cold. The dining room adjoined the parlor, separated by a wide archway that allowed warmth to flow freely between the two spaces. It was a room of generous proportions, dominated by a long oak table capable of seating perhaps 20 people. Tonight, places had been set for the dozen or so guests currently in residence, each setting arranged with simple but pleasing care. Candles in brass holders ran down the center of the table, their flames reflected in the polished wood surface. The walls were paneled in the same dark oak as the parlor, but here they were hung with paintings depicting pastoral scenes, harvests and meadows, and streams that suggested the moorland in its gentler seasons. A sideboard against one wall held serving dishes, kept warm by spirit lamps, their contents hidden beneath gleaming covers. Mrs. Hartwell indicated where guests might sit, though she did so with gentle suggestion rather than rigid instruction. The seating arranged itself naturally, with those who had been conversing in the parlor choosing to continue their companionship, while others who preferred solitude found places that offered it without isolation. Thomas Brennan found himself seated between Professor Wickham and a quiet gentleman who had arrived earlier in the day and spent most of the afternoon reading in his room. The professor nodded pleasantly, clearly prepared to offer conversation or silence, as Thomas preferred. The reading gentleman offered a brief smile before turning his attention to his napkin, which he arranged across his lap with precise movements. Mrs. Ashford sat across from them, flanked by the embroidering woman, whose name was Miss Weatherby, and the merchant's wife, Mrs. Denham. The three women fell easily into conversation, discussing the virtues of various needlework patterns and the challenges of maintaining good thread in winter's dry air. The servants began bringing food to the table, working with quiet efficiency. First came a tureen of soup, a thick vegetable pottage that steamed invitingly. Mrs. Hartwell herself ladled it into bowls, ensuring each guest received a generous portion. The soup carried the taste of root vegetables harvested before the first frost, their flavors concentrated and earthy, seasoned with herbs that must have been dried during the summer months. The guests ate with the focused attention that good food after long travel inspires. Spoons moved steadily from bowl to mouth. Bread was broken and buttered. The wine that Mrs. Hartwell offered, a modest red that she noted came from a vineyard to the south, was accepted by most and declined politely by a few who preferred water or the remaining cider. As the soup course concluded, serving platters were brought in bearing the main fare. A roasted joint of beef, cooked until its exterior was dark and savory, while its interior remained tender and pink. Roasted potatoes, their skins crisped to golden perfection. Carrots glazed with honey and butter. Cabbage braised until soft but not mushy. Everything spoke of careful preparation and an understanding of how to coax the best from simple ingredients. Professor Wickham remarked that he had rarely encountered better beef outside of his own city, a compliment that Mrs. Hartwell accepted with a pleased nod. She explained that the meat came from farms nearby, where cattle grazed on the moorland grasses during the warmer months, giving their flesh a particular character. The conversation around the table ebbed and flowed naturally. Mrs. Denham shared news from the larger market towns, speaking of price fluctuations and the availability of certain goods as winter progressed. Her husband, Mr. Denham, added observations about road conditions and which routes remained most reliably passable. Thomas found himself drawn into discussion with the professor, who asked thoughtful questions about Thomas's family and their circumstances. Thomas answered more openly than he had earlier, perhaps encouraged by the food and wine, or perhaps simply by the professor's genuine interest and lack of judgment. "My father and I parted on difficult terms some years ago," Thomas admitted, his voice low. "I've come to see if those terms might be revised, or at least understood better." Professor Wickham nodded slowly. "A worthy errand, especially at this time of year. Christmas has a way of softening old grievances, I've found, or at least of putting them in perspective." "I hope so," Thomas said. "I'm not certain of my welcome, but I felt compelled to try." The quiet gentleman beside them, who had been listening without intruding, spoke for the first time. The staircase at the Thornfield Arms rose from the entrance hall in a steady, confident climb. The steps were wide and shallow, built for comfort rather than economy of space, and the banister had been worn smooth by generations of hands. Wall sconces placed at regular intervals provided light enough to navigate safely, their flames protected by glass chimneys that prevented drafts from causing them to flicker. Thomas climbed slowly, his satchel in one hand, the other resting lightly on the banister. The day's travel had taken more from him than he had realized, and now that food and warmth had eased the immediate demands of survival, a deeper fatigue settled into his limbs. Yet there was also a nervous energy that kept him from feeling truly tired, an anticipation of what tomorrow would bring. At the first landing, a window looked out onto the courtyard below. Thomas paused there, peering through the glass into darkness. Snow fell heavily now, visible only where it passed through the glow of the courtyard lanterns. The wind had picked up, driving the flakes nearly horizontal at times. He could see the vague shapes of the stables and outbuildings, but little else. The moorland beyond had vanished entirely into the night. He continued upward to the second floor, where a corridor stretched in both directions. The walls here were covered in faded but still handsome wallpaper, a pattern of ivy and small flowers that suggested this section of the inn had been decorated with care. More sconces provided light, and the floorboards, though old, were solid and free of creaks. Mrs. Hartwell had indicated his room earlier, pointing it out when she showed him and the other guests upstairs before supper. It was the third door on the left, distinguished by a small brass number 3 affixed at eye level. He found it easily and turned the handle, stepping into the space that would be his sanctuary for the night. The room was modest but comfortable. A single bed occupied one wall, its frame of dark wood matched by a dresser and small writing desk arranged under the window. The bed had been made up with obvious care, the linens crisp and white, the blankets thick and inviting. A quilt lay folded at the foot, available if the night grew particularly cold. A washstand stood in one corner, complete with a basin and pitcher. Steam no longer rose from the water, but when Thomas tested it with his fingers, he found it still pleasantly warm. A small mirror hung above the washstand, and beside it, a towel had been draped over a wooden bar. The window looked out in the same direction as the landing window, toward the courtyard and the moorland beyond. Heavy curtains, matching the burgundy ones in the parlour, could be drawn against the cold, but Thomas left them open for now, watching the snow fall while he unpacked his few belongings. He placed his satchel on the writing desk and opened it carefully. Inside were clothes for a few days, a book he had been reading during the journey, and a letter. The letter was old, its paper yellowed and soft from frequent handling. He did not remove it, but his fingers brushed against it, acknowledging its presence. From his father, written 5 years ago, before the argument that had driven them apart. It was the last communication he had received, and he had carried it with him ever since, unable to reply, unwilling to discard it. Now, finally, he was traveling to deliver his response in person, assuming his father would agree to see him. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He closed the satchel and called, "Come in." A young maid entered, carrying a warming pan. "Begging your pardon, sir," she said with a bob of courtesy. "Mrs. Hartwell sent me to warm your bed, if you'd like." "That's very kind, thank you." The maid set about her task, sliding the warming pan between the sheets with practiced efficiency. The faint smell of heated metal and clean linen filled the room. She worked quickly and quietly, then withdrew with another small courtesy, closing the door gently behind her. Thomas stood alone in the warm room, listening to the muffled sounds of the inn around him. Footsteps in the corridor as other guests made their way to their chambers. The distant murmur of voices from the parlour below. The wind pressing against the window. All of it combined into a kind of symphony of shelter, each sound affirming that he was safe, warm, and protected from the storm. He poured water from the pitcher into the basin and washed his face and hands. The water was soothing, washing away not just the grime of travel, but some of the tension he had been carrying. He dried himself carefully, then changed into his nightshirt, placing his traveling clothes on the chair beside the desk. Before getting into bed, he returned to the window for one final look at the night. The snow showed no signs of stopping. Drifts were already forming against the stable walls, and along the fence that marked the edge of T. Mrs. Hartwell made her rounds as midnight approached, moving through the inn with the quiet assurance of someone who had performed this ritual countless times. The parlor had emptied, save for two elderly gentlemen engaged in a game of chess, their moves contemplative and unhurried. She checked that the fire was properly banked, adding one more log to ensure it would burn steadily through the small hours. "Can I bring you anything else, gentlemen?" she asked softly. The player, considering his next move, glanced up and smiled. "No, thank you, Mrs. Hartwell. We're quite content." She nodded and moved on, her steps barely audible on the old floorboards. The dining room had been set to rights hours ago, tables cleared, floors swept, everything prepared for breakfast service in the morning. She passed through it now only to check that the windows were properly latched against the strengthening wind. In the kitchen, her cook and the remaining staff were finishing their own suppers, seated around the long work table. They rose when she entered, but she waved them back down. "Finish your meal. You've all earned it. The guests are settled, and everything is as it should be." The cook, a stout woman named Mrs. Pierce, who had been with the inn for 20 years, poured Mrs. Hartwell a cup of tea and pressed it into her hands. "Sit for a moment. You've been on your feet since dawn." Mrs. Hartwell accepted the tea gratefully and lowered herself onto a stool. The warmth of the kitchen wrapped around her, different from the parlor's warmth, but equally welcome. This was her domain, her responsibility, and she felt the satisfaction that came from knowing it had been well tended. "The snow is quite heavy," Mrs. Pierce observed, gesturing toward the window where flakes pressed against the glass. "I doubt we'll see any travelers tomorrow." "Perhaps not," Mrs. Hartwell agreed, "though we have enough provisions, and the guests seem content to be stranded here if need be." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, sipping their tea. The kitchen carried the lingering sense of the evening's cooking, a pleasant mixture that would fade by morning, but now provided a kind of aromatic memory of the day's work. After finishing her tea, Mrs. Hartwell resumed her rounds. She climbed the stairs to the guest floor, her lamp casting gentle circles of light against the walls. The corridor was quiet, all the doors closed, occasional sounds of settling sleep drifting through the wood. She paused at each door, listening not for anything specific, but simply to confirm the peaceful rhythm of rest. At Thomas's door, she paused fractionally longer. Something in the young man's manner had caught her practiced eye, a tension that spoke of more than travel fatigue. She had been an innkeeper long enough to recognize the signs of someone carrying a burden beyond physical luggage, but she also knew that some burdens could only be set down in their own time, and that her role was simply to provide a safe place for that eventual unburdening. Satisfied that all was well, she continued to the third floor where the servants' quarters were located. The maids and stable hands were already asleep. She could hear soft snoring from behind one door, the rustling of someone turning over in another. These were good people, hard-working and loyal, and she counted herself fortunate to have them. Her own room was small but comfortable, tucked at the end of the corridor with a window that looked out over the moorland. Not that she could see anything of it now, only her own reflection in the dark glass, a woman of middle years with tired eyes but a satisfied expression. She prepared for bed slowly, performing the familiar rituals of washing and changing, brushing out her hair and plaiting it loosely. The room was cold despite the small stove in the corner, and she was grateful for the heavy nightgown and the quilts piled on her bed. Before extinguishing her lamp, she moved to the window and looked out at the storm. Snow fell in sheets now, driven by wind that howled around the eaves. But the inn stood firm, as it had stood for generations, a bulwark against winter's assault. Inside its walls, people slept safely, warm and fed and sheltered. This was her life's work, and she felt proud of it. She climbed into bed and pulled the quilts up to her chin. The mattress, worn to the exact shape of her body over years of use, welcomed her. She closed her eyes and listened to the storm, but it could not trouble her. She was home, in the place she loved, doing the work she valued. Sleep came quickly, and Mrs. Hartwell's last waking thought was a small prayer of gratitude for the inn, for her staff, for the guests who trusted her with their care, and for the storm that made her shelter all the more valuable. The inn settled into the profound quiet that belongs only to the hours between midnight and dawn. Outside, the storm continued its work, reshaping the landscape, erasing paths, building drifts that would take days to melt. Inside, warmth held steady, maintained by fires banked but still living, by thick walls and sound construction, by the care that had gone into every aspect of the building over generations. In his room, Thomas lay in that strange borderland between sleep and waking. His body rested, but his mind continued its restless turning. Dreams came and went, fragmentary and unclear. He saw his father's face, younger than it would be now, smiling at some long-ago moment. He saw the cottage where he had grown up, smoke rising from his chimney. He heard voices, words he couldn't quite make out, tones that shifted between welcoming and harsh. He turned over, seeking a more comfortable position, and the movement brought him closer to full wakefulness. The room was dark, except for the faintest glow from the banked coals in the small fireplace. He could hear the wind, a constant presence, and occasionally the creak of the building settling. These sounds, rather than disturbing him, provided a kind of comfort. He was not alone in the darkness. The inn surrounded him, solid and protective. His thoughts drifted to the letter in his satchel. His father's last words to him had been written in that letter. Words about duty and expectation, about choices and consequences. Thomas had been young then, determined to make his own way rather than follow the path his father had laid out. The argument that followed had been fierce, final, or so it had seemed at the time. But 5 years changed people. Thomas was not the same man who had stormed away from that cottage, convinced of his own rightness. He had learned things, experienced things that had softened his certainties. He had come to understand that stubbornness, while sometimes necessary, could also be a form of cowardice, a way of avoiding the hard work of reconciliation. Tomorrow, he would face whatever waited at his father's door. He would say the things he had come to say. And if his father turned him away, well, at least he would have tried. The attempt itself mattered, as the quiet gentleman at dinner had said. The attempt was its own form of courage. With this thought, a kind of peace settled over Thomas. His breathing deepened. The restless turning of his mind slowed and finally stilled. He slipped back into sleep, this time more deeply, more completely, and his dreams grew gentler, touched by the warmth and safety of the Thornfield Arms. In other rooms, other guests rested in their own ways. Professor Wickham slept with the stillness of someone whose conscience was clear and whose body knew how to make the most of rest. Mrs. Ashford, after a period of light dozing, fell into a deep sleep that would carry her through to morning. Miss Weatherby dreamed of embroidery patterns, endless variations of stitches forming themselves into beautiful designs. The young boy with the wooden blocks lay curled in his bed, one hand tucked under his cheek, breathing with the perfect ease of childhood. His parents slept in the room adjoining his, the door between left slightly ajar so they could hear him if he needed them. They held hands even in sleep, fingers loosely intertwined, a gesture so habitual they were unaware of it. The quiet gentleman who had spoken to Thomas at dinner sat up late, reading by lamplight. His book was thick and scholarly, but he read without strain, taking his time, occasionally pausing to gaze into the middle distance while he considered what he had read. Eventually, the words began to blur, and he acknowledged that sleep was calling. He marked his place, extinguished the lamp, and settled into bed with the sigh of someone content with the day's work. The chess players had finally concluded their game sometime past 1 in the morning. They had shaken hands, banged the parlor fire, and climbed the stairs together, still discussing various moves and strategies in low, friendly voices. Now they too slept, in rooms at opposite ends of the corridor, each dreaming perhaps of checkmates yet to come. The servants slept the deep sleep of those whose labor is physical and demanding. The stable hand dreamed of horses, their warm breath and gentle eyes. The maids dreamed of clean linens and polished silver, their dreams as orderly as their waking work. Mrs. Pierce, the cook, dreamed of recipes and kitchens past, a lifetime of meals prepared with care. Mrs. Hartwell slept lightly, as she always did, some part of her remaining alert to the inn's needs. She would wake at the slightest unusual sound, ready to investigate, to solve problems, to ensure her guests' comfort. But tonight all was well, and her light sleep was untroubled by any alarm. The fire in the great parlor burned lower and lower, its flames subsiding to glowing coals, its light fading to a decay. Dawn came slowly, reluctantly, as though winter itself was hesitant to release the night. The darkness did not lift so much as thin, gradually revealing the transformed landscape. Everything lay under a heavy blanket of snow, smooth and pristine, unmarked by any track or trail. The stable hand was first to wake, rising while true darkness still held. He dressed quickly in the cold of his small room, layering clothes against the chill, and made his way down to see to the horses. They greeted him with soft whinnies, hungry and ready for their morning feed. He worked by lamplight, measuring oats and hay, checking water troughs, running expert hands over legs and flanks to ensure all was well. Outside, he waded through drifts to reach the woodshed, returning with arms full of logs for the various fireplaces. The cold bit at his exposed skin, but the exercise warmed him from within. He noted with approval how well the inn's bulk had protected the courtyard, creating relative shelter where snow had accumulated less deeply. In the kitchen, Mrs. Pierce arrived shortly after, her face still soft with sleep, but her movements already purposeful. She lit lamps, stoked the great kitchen stove, and began the process of preparing breakfast. Dough that had been set to rise the night before was shaped into rolls and placed in the oven. A ham was brought from the larder, ready to be sliced and fried. Eggs were collected from the small henhouse attached to the kitchen, each one a small miracle on this frozen morning. The scent of baking bread began to permeate the inn, drifting up through floorboards and along corridors, a gentle summons to waking. One by one, the guests stirred, responding to this aromatic invitation and to the natural pull of morning, however reluctant. Thomas woke to grey light filtering around the curtains. For a moment, he was disoriented, unsure of where he was. Then memory returned. The inn, the storm, the journey he was making. He lay still for a moment, gathering himself, preparing mentally for what the day would bring. The room was cold, the fire having died completely during the night. He could see his breath misting in the air. But the bed was warm, the blankets heavy and comforting, and he was reluctant to leave them. Eventually, necessity won over comfort, and he rose quickly, dressing with speed, born of cold. At the window, he pulled back the curtains and looked out at the transformed world. Snow covered everything, softening edges, hiding familiar landmarks. The sky remained overcast, though whether more snow was coming or the storm had truly passed, he could not tell. The sight filled him with both awe and apprehension. Beautiful as it was, the snow would make his journey more difficult. Below, other rooms were coming to life. Doors opened and closed, water splashed in basins. The murmur of voices, still sleep-roughened, drifted through the walls. The inn was waking, its inhabitants emerging from the private worlds of sleep into the shared world of morning. Mrs. Hartwell, already dressed and composed, moved through the corridors, lighting lamps that had been extinguished during the night. She checked each floor, ensuring that warmth was spreading from the revived fires, that everything was ready to receive the guests when they descended. In the parlor, the fire had been rebuilt and now burned cheerfully, casting its warmth into the room. The chess pieces from last night's game had been put away, the board folded and stored. Fresh cushions had been placed on the chairs. The room looked ready, waiting, patient. Professor Wickham was among the first to descend, fully dressed and surprisingly alert for the early hour. He wished Mrs. Hartwell good morning and accepted her offer of tea in the parlor while breakfast was prepared. He settled near the fire with a newspaper someone had left behind, though its news was several days old by now. Mrs. Ashford came down shortly after, moving more stiffly than she had the evening before, her joints protesting the cold despite the inn's warmth. Mrs. Hartwell noticed and made a mental note to ensure extra blankets were provided for the coming night. "Did you rest well?" Mrs. Hartwell asked. "Wonderfully," Mrs. Ashford replied. "I cannot remember the last time I slept so soundly." "Your inn is a treasure, Mrs. Hartwell." "You're very kind. Breakfast will be ready shortly. In the meantime, please make yourself comfortable." The young boy appeared on the stairs, descending with the careful attention children give to steps when they're not quite fully awake. His mother followed, a gentle hand on his shoulder. They joined the others in the parlor, the boy gravitating immediately toward the fire, holding out his hands to its warmth. One by one, the guests assembled. Some came down eager and ready for the day. Others appeared still half wrapped in sleep, moving slowly, requiring tea or coffee before they could fully engage with the morning. But all were drawn by the SMA. When Mrs. Hartwell announced breakfast, the guests filed into the dining room with more animation than they had shown the night before. Morning, even a cold winter morning, brought with it a kind of energy that night lacked. There was something to do, somewhere to go, even if only in intention rather than immediate action. The table had been set with care, each place marked by plain but clean china, sturdy cutlery, and crisp napkins. The center of the table held platters and serving dishes, their contents sending up gentle wisps of steam. The smell alone was enough to stir appetite. Fresh bread, fried ham, eggs, prepared in multiple ways to suit various preferences. Guests seated themselves in roughly the same configuration as the previous evening. Comfort and familiarity already establishing themselves. Professor Wickham took his place with a nod to Thomas, who sat beside him. Mrs. Ashford arranged herself across the table, flanked again by Miss Weatherby and Mrs. Denham. "I hope everyone slept well despite the storm," Mrs. Hartwell said, moving around the table with a pot of coffee. "We're quite snowed in, I'm afraid. Hobbs reports that the road is impassable until it's cleared, which likely won't happen until this afternoon at the earliest." This news was met with various reactions. Some guests seemed unbothered, even pleased to have an excuse to remain in the inn's comfort. Others looked concerned, calculating delays and changed plans. Thomas felt his heart sink slightly, though he tried not to show it. "Is there no way through at all?" he asked. Mrs. Hartwell poured coffee into his cup, her expression sympathetic. "The main road is blocked by drifts in several places. Hobbs says he's seen worse, but it will take considerable work to clear. Were you hoping to continue your journey today?" "I was," Thomas admitted. "Though I suppose another day won't make much difference in the grand scheme of things." Professor Wickham, spreading butter on a slice of fresh bread, spoke without looking up. "Sometimes delay serves a purpose. It gives us time to prepare ourselves more fully for what we're about to face." Thomas glanced at him, wondering if the professor somehow knew his situation, but the older man's expression revealed nothing beyond gentle philosophy. Thomas nodded and turned his attention to his plate, accepting eggs and ham from the serving dishes being passed around. The meal proceeded with the pleasant casualness of breakfast among travellers. Conversation was lighter than at supper, more concerned with immediate matters, the quality of the food, excellent, the depth of the snow, considerable, the prospects for the weather improving, uncertain. The young boy ate with the focused intensity children bring to morning meals, barely pausing to breathe between bites. His mother reminded him gently to slow down, that the food wasn't going anywhere. He nodded, but continued at much the same pace, already planning what adventures the snow might offer once he was permitted outside. Miss Weatherby mentioned that she had hoped to reach her sister's house by this evening, as they had planned to spend several days together before Christmas. "But I suppose she'll understand the delay," she added philosophically. "One cannot control the weather, after all." "Indeed not," agreed Mr. Denham, the merchant, "though it plays havoc with business schedules. I had appointments in town that will now have to be postponed." His wife patted his hand consolingly. "The world will not end if your appointments must wait. Perhaps this is a reminder to slow down, to take a breath." He smiled at her, a look passing between them that spoke of long understanding. "Perhaps you're right, my dear. Perhaps you're right." As plates emptied and coffee cups were refilled, the conversation turned to how the day might be spent. The chess players mentioned resuming their game. Mrs. Ashford thought she might attempt some correspondence, as she had writing materials in her room. Miss Weatherby planned to work on her embroidery. The quiet gentleman who had spoken to Thomas the night before said nothing, but seemed content to let the day unfold as it would. Thomas remained silent, his mind turning over his options. He could wait for the road to be cleared, remain safely at the inn, postpone his errand. Or he could attempt the journey on foot. It was only 10 miles to his father's cottage. In good weather, a manageable walk. In snow this deep, more challenging, but perhaps not impossible. As if reading his thoughts, Mrs. Hartwell paused beside his chair. "Mr. Brennan, if I might have a word when you've finished your meal." He nodded, curious and slightly apprehensive. When breakfast concluded and the other guests dispersed to their various activities, he remained at the table. Mrs. Hartwell sat down across from him, her expression kind but serious. The next hour passed in quiet but purposeful activity. Thomas returned to his room and dressed in his warmest clothes, layering wool and flannel against the cold he would soon face. He repacked his satchel, ensuring everything was secure and protected from potential snow. The letter from his father he tucked into an interior pocket, close to his heart. Downstairs, Mrs. Hartwell and her staff assembled supplies. A canvas pack appeared, filled with items that might prove useful: bread and cheese wrapped in waxed cloth, a small bottle of brandy, matches in a waterproof container, an extra scarf, and thick gloves lined with fleece. Mrs. Pierce added a thermos filled with hot sweet tea, strong enough to revive cold limbs. Hobbs, summoned from the stables, spread a map across the parlor table. It was hand-drawn but detailed, showing not just the main road, but also the paths and tracks that crisscrossed the moorland. He traced a route with a thick finger, speaking in his slow, deliberate way. The main roads blocked here and here. He indicated 2 points. But if you cut across the moor from the old stone marker, you can rejoin the road past the worst of the drifts. It'll add maybe a mile to your journey, but the walking will be easier. Keep the ridge line on your left and you can't go wrong. Thomas studied the map, committing it to memory. "How long do you think it will take?" Hobbs considered. "In good conditions, 3 hours perhaps. In this snow, maybe 4 or 5. Don't try to rush. Steady pace. Watch your footing. Stop if you need to rest. The cold is more dangerous than the distance." "I understand. Thank you." Professor Wickham, who had been listening from his chair by the fire, rose and approached. "Mr. Brennan, I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I wonder if you would accept a small gift for your journey." He held out a small leather-bound book, worn but well cared for. Thomas took it carefully, opening to the first page, where an inscription read, "To face difficulty with courage is to be already halfway to success." "My father gave me that book many years ago," the professor said. "I've carried it on many journeys. It seems to me you might benefit from its company more than I do at present. You can return it to me when your business is concluded." Thomas felt emotion tighten his throat. "I don't know what to say. This is very generous. Say you'll be careful out there, and that you'll give your father a fair chance, whatever history lies between you." "I will, I promise." Mrs. Ashford contributed a pair of wool mittens, claiming she had 2 pairs and could spare 1. Miss Weatherby tied a bright red ribbon to his pack, saying it would help him be visible against the snow. Even the young boy approached shyly, offering a smooth stone he had found, claiming it was for luck. These small kindnesses, these gestures from people he barely knew, touched Thomas deeply. He had arrived at the inn as a stranger, worried and alone. Now As he prepared to leave, he felt supported, encouraged, sent forth with goodwill and genuine concern for his welfare. When everything was ready, Mrs. Hartwell walked with him to the entrance hall. Outside, visible through the windows, the day had grown brighter, though the sky remained overcast. The snow had stopped falling at last, and the air looked crystalline and still. "Are you certain about this?" she asked one final time. Thomas adjusted the pack on his shoulders and nodded. "I am. I've waited 5 years. I can't wait any longer." "Then go with our blessings. And Mr. Brennan, whatever happens, you'll have a room here tonight if you need it. Remember that." He smiled, grateful beyond words. Then he pulled on his gloves, wrapped the extra scarf around his neck, and stepped out into the cold. The temperature hit him like a physical force, stealing his breath momentarily. But he adjusted, pulling his scarf up over his nose and mouth, squinting against the brightness of sun on snow. Behind him, the inn stood warm and welcoming, smoke still rising from its chimneys. Ahead, the moorland stretched white and trackless, beautiful and austere. Thomas took a deep breath and began walking. His boots crunched in the snow, each step requiring slightly more effort than normal. But the air was invigorating, and the exercise would keep him warm. He set his face toward the stone marker Hobbs had described and pushed forward into the transformed landscape. Behind him, framed in the inn's windows, several faces watched him go. Mrs. Hartwell, Professor Wickham, Mrs. Ashford, and others, all standing witness to his departure, all silently willing him success in his mission. The sight gave him strength, and he raised one hand in farewell before turning away to focus on the journey ahead. The Thornfield Arms receded behind him, growing smaller with each step. Soon it was just a dark shape against the white expanse, then a blur, then gone from sight entirely. As he descended into a shallow, the first mile proved the most difficult as Thomas adjusted to the rhythm of walking through deep snow. Each step required concentration, finding solid ground beneath the powder, avoiding hidden rocks or hollows that might turn an ankle. His breath came harder than normal, forming clouds that froze on his scarf and eyebrows. But gradually he found his pace. Not fast, but steady. And as his body warmed from the exertion, the cold became less oppressive. He could appreciate the stark beauty of the landscape, the way the snow had softened every harsh edge, turning the moorland into something almost dreamlike. He passed the stone marker Hobbs had described, a tall standing stone that must have been ancient even when the inn was built. Snow had drifted against it, creating a smooth curve like a wave frozen in time. From here, he turned more northward, following the line of a ridge just visible through the snow. The silence was profound. No wind disturbed the air. No birds called. His own footsteps and breathing were the only sounds in a world that seemed to be holding its breath. It was both peaceful and slightly eerie, this absolute quiet. He understood how easily a person could lose themselves in such emptiness, but he had Hobbs's map committed to memory and landmarks to follow. There, a distinctive cluster of 3 trees. Further on, a tumble of stone that had once been a shepherd's shelter. Each confirmation of his route gave him confidence, kept doubt at bay. After perhaps 2 hours, he stopped to rest, finding a relatively snow-free spot beneath a rocky overhang. He ate some of the bread and cheese Mrs. Pierce had packed and drank tea from the thermos. The hot liquid was ambrosia, warming him from the inside out. He allowed himself 10 minutes of rest, no more, knowing that if he sat too long, the cold would stiffen his muscles and make continuing even harder. As he walked, his mind drifted to his father. What would the old man's reaction be? Anger, pleasure, indifference? Thomas had rehearsed various scenarios countless times, but he knew none of his imaginings might match reality. His father had always been unpredictable, capable of unexpected tenderness one moment and harsh judgment the next. Their argument had been about Thomas's refusal to take over the family trade. His father was a skilled carpenter, and he had assumed his son would follow in his footsteps. But Thomas had wanted something different, though what exactly he couldn't articulate even to himself. He wanted more, or different, or simply his own choice in the matter. So he had left, angry and self-righteous, convinced of his independence. And for 5 years, he had tried to build the life he claimed to want. He had worked various jobs, never settling, never quite finding what he sought. And gradually, the anger had faded, replaced by something else. Regret, perhaps, or simply maturity's understanding that stubbornness and pride were poor substitutes for family. Now he was walking through snow, to try to repair what he had broken, or at least to acknowledge that it was broken. He didn't expect forgiveness. He would settle for acknowledgement, for the chance to speak his piece and hear his father's response, whatever it might be. The third hour brought him to the point where he could rejoin the main road. Here, Hobbs had been right. The road showed signs of use, tracks where someone had attempted to drive through. The going was easier now, and Thomas increased his pace slightly, eager to reach his destination. He passed a few isolated cottages, smoke rising from their chimneys, signs of life within. He thought about stopping, asking for shelter or directions, but he was too close now. Another hour, perhaps less, and he would be at his father's door. Best to continue. The landscape grew more familiar. He had grown up in this area, had played among these hills as a boy. Memory overlaid the present, showing him summer greens beneath winter whites, showing him paths now hidden under snow. Each recognition was both painful and sweet, a reminder of what he had left behind. And then, as he crested a low rise, he saw it, his father's cottage, sitting in its small clearing, looking mud as it always had. Smoke rose from the chimney. The windows were intact. Someone was home. Thomas stopped, his heart suddenly pounding. This was it, the moment he had journeyed toward, prepared for, feared, and hoped for in equal measure. He stood on the rise, looking down at the cottage, gathering himself. The walk had been long and cold and difficult, but compared to what came next, it had been easy. Now he had to walk up to that door, knock, and face whatever awaited him. He took a deep breath, adjusted his pack, and started down the slope toward the cottage. His father's cottage. Home. Thomas stood before the door of his father's cottage, his hand raised to knock, hesitating at the final moment. The wood was weathered but well maintained, showing the carpenter's care that his father brought to all things. A simple wreath of holly hung at eye level, the bright berries startling against the dark wood. Someone had decorated for Christmas. He could hear sounds from within. The crackle of a fire, the shuffle of footsteps, the clink of pottery. Someone was home, going about the ordinary business of the day, unaware that their afternoon was about to be interrupted. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest. 5 years of absence, 5 years of silence, all compressed into this single moment. What would he say? How would he begin? The speeches he had prepared during the long walk suddenly seemed inadequate, ridiculous even. But he had not come all this way, had not faced the storm and the cold and his own fear to turn back now. He took a breath, gathered his courage, and knocked. The sounds within ceased. A pause, perhaps of surprise. Then footsteps approached the door. Thomas had a final moment to prepare himself, to set his features, to breathe. The door opened. An old man stood there, though not as old as Thomas had feared. His father had aged, certainly. His hair was grayer, his face more lined. But he stood straight, his carpenter's shoulders still broad, his eyes still sharp and clear. Those eyes widened in recognition, and for a long moment neither man spoke. "Thomas," his father said at last, his voice rough with surprise or emotion or both. "Hello, father." Another pause. Thomas waited, prepared for anything, for the door to close in his face, for angry words, for rejection. Instead, his father stepped back, pulling the door wider. "You'd better come in. It's too cold to stand talking on the doorstep." It was not a warm invitation, but neither was it a dismissal. Thomas stepped